Greetings. Welcome to the class, War and Society. My name is Chris Webb, and I'm going to be your instructor for this class. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Duke. I do not yet have the title of professor, so don't worry about calling me doctor or professor. I'm finishing my doctorate next year. I remember when I was a freshman undergraduate many years ago, that's something that wasn't very clear to me. So I'm going to try to be clear about that for you in case you don't know about this. Professor is a title that is awarded in time, and not everyone teaching your college classes has that title. Some of us are lecturers who only have a teaching responsibility and no research responsibility. And some of us, like me, are graduates who are in the process of earning our doctorate. You can call me Chris. That's totally fine. Some of you, if you feel more comfortable with Mr. Webb, that's okay, but it's certainly not necessary. This is War and Society, and I appreciate that you're taking this class. Right here at the beginning, I want to acknowledge we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this class was originally designed to be in the classroom, and unfortunately I had to make the decision to change it and take it entirely online and repurpose the class to make it compatible in that way. So I appreciate that you're still taking the class, and I appreciate your patience and your flexibility. This is still a learning experience for all of us. This is a situation that none of us really wanted. So please be patient with me as I try to work through this format. I'm going to be patient with you as well. My goal is to make this class as user-friendly and clear as possible, since we're no longer going to have access to some of the collaborative activities that I originally had planned. I'm going to run this as more of a traditional lecture and reading based format. I'm going to assign you readings each week. I'm going to post them to Sakai. And I'm also going to post at least one lecture video each week that I'd like you to watch. And the way that I'll do these lecture videos is I'm going to try to distill the primary points that I want you to understand. So in this way, the lectures are going to be they're going to be kind of condensed and maybe a little bit sterile in comparison to traditional classroom instruction. My goal is to make the information clear to you and to help you see as easily as possible what you should be taking from the readings. I will also be hosting a Zoom meeting on Fridays, and I've made the decision to make these Zoom meetings non-mandatory. I'm going to do a recap of the week's readings, and I'm primarily doing this to give you the opportunity to ask me questions if you want to do that. I taught a class over the summer this way and tried to have participation in the Zoom meetings being mandatory. And in reality, people were scattered all over the world in various circumstances, still trying to figure out what was going on. And it was pretty hard for everyone to coordinate participation at the same time. So I've decided to make these meetings non-mandatory this semester. I'm going to host them and I'm going to post them for you to view later if you're able to attend, if you're not able to attend. Right now, I think these meetings are going to be held tentatively around 10:30 a.m. on Fridays. From my previous experience, I think that we can expect these meetings to be about an hour in duration if many of you attend them. And if that doesn't work for you, let me know. I might be able to move it around a little bit to accommodate you. But if that's not possible, don't worry about it too much. I'll be posting these discussions for you to watch. And if you have questions for me, you can reach out by email and I'll try to help you. I'm not going to be holding regular office hours, but rather I'm going to be available by appointment. Just reach out to me and we can arrange a virtual meeting to talk about whatever you need to talk about. So before we discuss the class material, let's talk for a minute about grading. This is a writing intensive course, which means that the bulk of your grade is going to come from writing assignments. 25% of your grade is going to come from participation, and this should be an easy grade for you to attain. All you have to do is turn your work in regularly and engage with me if there are issues. If there is an issue, reach out to me and let me know so we can find a strategy to accommodate your situation. Communication with me counts as participation. People have issues, life happens. I totally understand that. I have issues too, and life happens to me too. And I'm not going to punish you for that. Just let me know what's going on so that we can work it out. Another 25% of your grade is going to come from weekly reflection papers that are going to be based on our readings. And I would like you to turn these in each week prior to the Zoom meetings on Fridays. These are going to be the equivalent of 1 to 2 double-spaced pages. And I'm not asking you to do very much with these. I'm asking you to summarize the readings and lecture material and put them in context with each other so that I can see that you understand what you read. Just doing that minimum each week is going to earn you a 9 out of 10 grade on that reflection. If you go beyond that or develop your paper beyond just a summary, you can earn a 10 out of 10. In the past, I've tried to get students to post these on a discussion forum and interact with each other and post comments on each other's reflections. And in reality, times are tough right now, and people weren't really doing that very much. So I'm going to have you just turn these in to me by email. So by the time of our Zoom meeting each Friday, I would like you to have submitted your reflection to me by email. Another 25% of your grade is going to come from a midterm paper. I'll give you a prompt for that in the next couple of weeks. And the final 25% of your grade is going to come from a final paper, which will effectively act as your final exam. So you'll receive the prompt for that paper later in the semester too. So if you have questions about grading, just contact me and let me know, and I'm going to do my very best to try to help you with that. Again, my goal is to try to help you get what you need to get out of this class. I'm not trying to trick you or deceive you or put out roadblocks or things that are going to make it hard for you to pass the course. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce myself a little bit more, and then we can talk about the subject of our class. Again, my name is Chris Webb. I'm a doctoral candidate in cultural anthropology at Duke, and I'm what you would call a medical anthropologist. There are a lot of subfields in anthropology, and there are sub-subfields. Mine is medical anthropology. Put simply, the things that I study tend to deal with themes related broadly to the practice of medicine, notably the culture of medicine and the influence of medicine and culture. I also study militarism and trauma, particularly in a North American context. I'm also interested in things like how gender and race shape the experiences of these different things. Most anthropologists have one or more field sites, which are often, but not necessarily, geographically located places where we conduct research. My current field site is a community of Native American elders and healers who conduct purification rituals and healing rituals for military veterans after war. Once upon a time, many years ago, I was in the military, and I was wounded in combat and retired by the military due to my wounds. The personal experience of trying to live in the aftermath of that, including not only the combat trauma, but also trying to deal with things like the ethical implications of having participated in that war, inspired my current research focus. Specifically, I study the ways that meta-narratives about war and trauma, particularly through the PTSD diagnosis, and therapies that are designed to treat it, shape and constrain the ways that not only how veterans experience life and healing after war, but also the ways that our society is allowed to talk about, understand, and address war. Anthropologists are very concerned with meaning. What does something mean? What does it mean that veterans occupy the space that they do in our society? What does it mean that we have to use this language of PTSD, trauma, and healing to discuss the impact of war? What does it tell us about how we are supposed to understand war and the people who fight it? What does that disallow us from understanding? Whose experiences of war are not included in this narrative? What is the culture of the military? What's the culture of the VA hospitals that veterans occupy in their post-military lives? And how does military culture curate and filter the experience of race and gender by people who serve? Those are the kinds of questions that anthropologists ask about the things that we study. I know that this class was listed, I listed it as both a sociology course and an anthropology course. And I want to say a few things about that. I do have some background in sociology, but I'm currently in an anthropology department. My degrees are in anthropology. Anthropology is a big discipline with 4 major subfields: cultural anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and physical anthropology, which is also called biological anthropology, or here at Duke, evolutionary anthropology. I'm a cultural anthropologist. Today, cultural anthropology and sociology are much more similar than they used to be, and they have a lot of overlap. Sociologists study human social behavior and the structures of society. Cultural anthropologists study culture, broadly defined. These things obviously overlap a lot, and the difference used to matter a whole lot more than it does now, like 100 years ago, for example. Um, when sociologists were thought of as the social scientists who study modern European type societies, and anthropologists studied others. They used to say primitive people, but that's not something that we say anymore. That's not representative of how we see people. Through time, we realized that the distinctions between different societies, particularly through framing some as more modern than others, is kind of inaccurate. This has caused our disciplines to overlap much more than they used to. A contemporary sociologist can study non-Western hunter-gatherer cultures, and a contemporary anthropologist can study corporate culture in the contemporary United States. Um, but we do differ a little bit in our approach to our studies. Though we sometimes study largely the same things, in some cases, sociologists tend to do much more quantitative studies of their subject. They use surveys and questionnaires and structured interviews, and they analyze their data using statistical methods. Um, Sociologists are also more likely to approach their study through the lens of social problems and what causes them and how do we solve them, etc. Things like, why are people from certain neighborhoods more likely to become incarcerated than people from other neighborhoods? How do graduation rates differ among kids with disabilities, various disabilities? Taking those same examples, an anthropologist is more likely to ask, what is it like to live in that neighborhood? What is it like to be incarcerated in this prison? What is it like to go to high school with a disability? And anthropologists use qualitative methods to study our subject. An anthropologist in the prison example would spend a large amount of time in the prison, in person, studying that. Perhaps every day for a year, more or less. We'll eat with people and we'll try to get to know them. We'll try to make observations about the culture of the place where we are. For anthropologists, doing that kind of in-person, long-term analysis, often through what we call participant observation, um, which we later analyze and publish in articles and books, is called ethnography. Sometimes the things that we publish, like those books, are also called ethnographies. So sociologists also do ethnographic research, and anthropologists conduct structured interviews and do statistical analysis. However, the disciplines do kind of skew in those different ways, respectively. Because I'm an anthropologist, and we will use some anthropological methods in this course, let's take a minute to talk a little bit more about what that means and what really makes cultural anthropology what it is. And I think that'll help us understand the way that we're approaching this class a little bit. So like I said, historically, cultural anthropology used to be thought of as the study of other people, tribes and villages and people that were seen as being primitive. However, anthropology can really be best thought as the study of culture. And what exactly is culture? A definition that I like to use is that it's the behaviors and habits of people with particular emphasis on behavior that is learned. Um, Cultural anthropologists, much more so than some other scientific disciplines, tend to believe that a significant amount of human behavior is learned. We realized as a discipline over a century ago that human difference, which used to be described as being something inherent and different because of race, um, we realize that's not the case. A human difference cannot be attributed to race as a biological concept. The notion of race is a socially constructed idea that's not really validated by biology. No group of people on Earth is inherently more violent or gentle or intelligent or industrious than any other. Thus, the differences inhuman behavior around the world can be described as a combination of the diverse environments that people inhabit, as well as the diverse traditions that people learn. We humans are very good at social reproduction, a phenomena that seems to be virtually universal. We see this all over the world, is that as different as humans are, as different as our societies are in different places, pretty much every culture on earth has behaviors and beliefs and standards that they believe or we believe to be inherent, either inherent in humanity or inherent in something like this, just the DNA of the universe. This is just the way things are. Um, an example, there are an infinite number of ways that people around the world understand kinship. And by kinship, I mean the way that people understand things like who their parents, their cousins, and uncles and aunts are. And these schemas can be very, very different for people in different places. However, people tend to imagine that the way that they understand kinship is something that's universal. It's a fundamental thing that's just them analyzing what is there, but it's not universal. These are the sorts of things that anthropologists tend to study. And this is entirely true of Western European and American society. I remember many years ago, I was at the dentist, and the dental assistant asked me what I did, and I said, I'm an anthropologist. And she started talking to me, and I remember her saying, I just love culture. There's so much culture around the world, but we don't have any. And what she meant when she said we was she was identifying with me as a white American person. And she was saying that she saw people all over the world as having this thing called culture, but that she didn't really see culture in our society. And one big reason for that is that we take our own culture for granted. Um, it seems that a lot of things in our culture seem to be so innate and so fundamental to us. And this applies to most of the world's cultures. People all over the world see their own cultures this way, that we just don't see our own habits and behaviors as being culture. However, Western European and American society operates just as much on learned and socially constructed rituals and behaviors as anybody else in the world. This argument that this is the case, though, can get very contentious sometimes. And at times it has and does put anthropology at odds with other disciplines and groups. And sociologists tend to hold this belief too, that the bulk probably of human behavior is socially constructed and learned. Um, a prominent example of this that has gotten a lot of attention today is the notions like gender and sexuality. Anthropologists who have studied many dozens or hundreds of world cultures know that the expressions of gender and sexuality are profoundly diverse around the world. But this goes against some really entrenched social norms about gender and sexuality in our own society. And for many people, it is simply impossible to imagine that the way that we, and when I say we, I mean European and American society, the one that I inhabit. Um, it's simply impossible to imagine that the way that we understand gender and sexuality is not absolutely inherent and universal. It's just the way it is, people will say, except it isn't. Another example that will matter in this class is the archetype of progress. Our culture tends to see people around the world as being like distributed across time. We see some people as being more primitive than others, and European society is seen as being the most advanced in time. And we imagine that every society on earth is sort of striving in this forward progressing motion. But anthropologists don't really believe this. One of the things that happens in our experience, though, is when someone in a society gets presented with a behavior from a different society that is different, and it makes us say, okay, yes, I see that people do things differently. It's not the same way that we do it. Um, they'll say, but the way that we do it is better. Um, there's a name for this. It's called ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism describes both the judgment of other societies by the standards of one's own culture, and also the perspective that the way that one's own culture does things is categorically better than how everybody else does it. And anthropologists tend to strive against ethnocentrism in our work. The discipline of cultural anthropology, almost by default, if not by intentional design, through the study of learned human behavior, is often the study of things that are taken for granted. An unfortunate reality of this is that sometimes this makes people feel a little bit upset. If we're talking about a norm or a behavior, and we describe something as being socially constructed, when someone really holds to that norm or behavior and believes that it's something that's inherent and normative and important, it can be very upsetting. And I recognize this, and I have a commitment as an anthropologist to resist ethnocentrism. However, I understand that we come from different places, and we often have different ways of seeing things. I'm not going to grandstand and try to tell you what you're supposed to believe. I'm not here to talk down to you and try to tell you that you are wrong. What I will ask you to do, and what is an expectation in this class, is for you to consider what you might be taking for granted when you're judging something. So I'm going to move on now from talking about anthropology and anthropological methods and just take a minute to address more specifically the subject of our class before I let you go. This class is called War and Society. We aim to study the social dimensions of war. How is war understood and experienced by people around the world? Our goal will be the critical cross-cultural study of war in all of its aspects, with intentional emphasis placed upon how war is constructed, practiced, and experienced today. We'll utilize anthropological methods in this study, looking closely at the variability in how different groups of people even understand what war is. Extra attention will be given to the notion of combat trauma, such as PTSD, which has become one of the most prominent metrics for translating battlefield experience to civilian populations in the contemporary world, and translating battlefield experience to the people who fight in wars too. So we're going to divide this class into 3 segments. The first segment of the class is called What is War? For this first segment, we're going to zoom out. This section is not going to be particularly critical. We're just going to look at some different examples of groups of people who have been labeled as having a particularly conspicuous practice of something called war. In Western society, we tend to apply the construct of warrior cultures to people like this. So for this first section in the class, we're going to remain much more light on critical analysis, and we'll just basically study a few different groups of people and how they practice or historically practiced war. And just a note on that, we'll read a couple of older texts while we're doing this, and a couple of these texts have some parts that would be considered maybe a little problematic by contemporary standards, and we'll talk about that later. I'm not assigning these texts to try to tell you that the people who wrote them were perfect and their judgments were absolutely correct. Sometimes that's not the case. But like I said, for this first segment, we're just gonna look at some different examples of people who have been given this label of being warriors or warrior cultures. For the second segment of the class, we're going to call it Empire of Trauma. Here, we'll start to focus a little bit more on the practice of war in the contemporary world, particularly in North American society. I'm going to put on my medical anthropologist hat a little bit more here, and we'll observe that the object of combat trauma has become deeply and profoundly entwined with the way that people in contemporary Western society imagine war and war experience. We're going to talk about shell shock and PTSD and more recent constructs such as moral injury in this segment. The third segment of this class is called The Formation of the Warrior. This segment is a study of the people who fight wars. In particular, we're going to study the social and psychological world of contemporary warfighters. Um, what is a warrior culture? And also, why do increasing numbers of people in contemporary society, including in professions outside of the military, identify as warriors? Those are the kinds of things we'll talk about in that third segment. I want to give a little bit of a content warning. This class will involve the discussion of violence, and it will require some reading of accounts of war. Many people have been impacted by war in very personal ways, and this includes me, and it can make the discussion of this kind of material difficult. So if you feel like your personal experience with war could make this class difficult for you, please talk to me. Talk to me about that, and we'll see what we can work out. And also, if anyone has special needs, please talk to me about that as well, and I'll see if there's something that I can do to make this class more accessible to you. I'm going to stop there for now. For your first reading assignments, please read the syllabus and the other readings that I'm going to have posted on Sakai for you. All of the readings this semester are going to be posted on Sakai. You don't have to buy any books or anything like that. I don't have all the readings up yet, but they will be there soon. So I look forward to seeing those of you who are able to attend on our Zoom meeting on Friday. Take care.